Sarah Martinez had always been afraid of water. Growing up in the desert town of Phoenix, Arizona, swimming pools were luxury items that her family couldn't afford. The closest she came to deep water was the occasional splash in the community center's shallow kiddie pool during summer heat waves. So when she enlisted in the Navy at 19, the thought of mandatory swim training filled her with dread that kept her awake for nights. The recruitment officer had glossed over the water training requirements, focusing instead on the technical opportunities and educational benefits. Sarah was drawn to the Navy's promise of electronics training and the chance to serve her country while building a better future. Her parents, both hardworking immigrants who cleaned office buildings at night, were proud but worried about their daughter's decision to join the military. Boot camp at Great Lakes Naval Training Center arrived faster than Sarah had anticipated. The first few weeks focused on marching, physical fitness, and classroom instruction. Sarah excelled in academics and showed determination in physical training, earning respect from her drill instructors. Her bunk mates knew her as quiet but reliable, someone who would help others with their studies late into the night. But everyone knew that water training was coming. The rumors spread through the barracks like wildfire. Stories of recruits who had washed out because they couldn't handle the swimming requirements. Tales of the infamous drown-proofing exercise that separated the strong from the weak. Sarah listened to these stories with growing anxiety, her stomach churning every time someone mentioned the pool. When the day finally arrived, Sarah stood at the edge of the Olympic-sized training pool with 40 other nervous recruits. The water looked impossibly deep and dark. The smell of chlorine burned her nostrils as she watched other groups of trainees already in the water, some struggling, others moving with confidence that she envied. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, a weathered man with 20 years of Navy experience, stood before the group with his arms crossed. His voice carried across the pool deck as he explained the basics of Navy water survival. Every sailor, he declared, must be comfortable in the water because the ocean doesn't care about your background or fears. The first exercise was basic treading water. Sarah watched as her fellow recruits jumped in one by one. Some moved through the water like they were born in it. Others struggled, but managed to keep their heads above the surface. When her turn came, Sarah's hands were shaking as she approached the pool's edge. The water was colder than she expected. As soon as she hit the surface, panic set in. Her arms flailed wildly as she tried to remember the techniques they had just learned. Water rushed in her mouth and nose as she fought to stay afloat. The lifeguard was beside her within seconds, pulling her to the side of the pool as she coughed and sputtered. "Martinez!" Chief Rodriguez's voice boomed across the pool. What was that supposed to be? Sarah's face burned with embarrassment as she clung to the pool's edge, still catching her breath. Around her, she could hear snickers from some of the other recruits. Someone whispered loud enough for her to hear. How did she even make it through the physical fitness test? "I'm sorry, Chief," Sarah managed to say between coughs. "I'll do better." "You'll do better?" Rodriguez walked over to where Sarah was hanging onto the pool's edge. "Martinez, you just went into panic mode the second you hit the water. This isn't a game. In the Navy, your life might depend on your ability to survive in water." The other recruits had stopped their own exercises to watch the spectacle. Sarah felt 40 pairs of eyes on her as she struggled to compose herself. The chlorinated water still burned her throat, and her soaked uniform clung uncomfortably to her skin. "Chief, maybe she should consider a different branch," called out Recruit Thompson, one of the stronger swimmers who had been showing off his butterfly stroke earlier. "The Army doesn't require swimming, right?" Laughter rippled through the group. Even some of the recruits who had struggled with their own swimming seemed relieved to have someone performing worse than them. Sarah's cheeks burned hotter than the Arizona sun she had left behind. Rodriguez silenced the group with a sharp look, but Sarah caught the expression on his face. It was a mixture of concern and disappointment that cut deeper than any harsh words could have. She realized that her drill instructor was already writing her off, already assuming she wouldn't make it through the program. "Everyone back to your exercises," Rodriguez commanded. "Martinez, you're going to sit this one out and watch." Pay attention to how the others move in the water. Sitting on the pool deck in her dripping uniform, Sarah watched her fellow recruits continue their training. The easy confidence of the experienced swimmers made her feel even more inadequate. They moved through the water like it was their natural element, while she felt like she was drowning in her own fear. The worst part wasn't the physical discomfort or even the embarrassment. It was the look of pity she saw in some eyes and the barely concealed relief in others. She was becoming the cautionary tale, the example of what happens when you're not prepared for Navy life. As the training session continued, Sarah overheard conversations that weren't meant for her ears. Recruits speculating about whether she would be dropped from the program. Bets being placed on how long she would last. The assumption that someone who couldn't handle basic treading water had no business being in the Navy. When the session finally ended, Sarah walked back to the barracks alone. Her wet uniform squeaked with each step, a constant reminder of her failure. She passed groups of recruits discussing the day's training, but conversations stopped when they saw her approaching. The isolation was almost as painful as the fear itself. That night, as she lay in her narrow bunk listening to the sounds of 40 women settling in for sleep, Sarah stared at the ceiling and wondered if everyone was right. Maybe she had made a terrible mistake. Maybe someone who grew up afraid of water had no business trying to serve in the Navy. But somewhere in the darkness, beneath the embarrassment and fear, a small flame of determination flickered. Sarah had not come this far to give up after one bad day. She thought about her parents, working their night shifts to support the family, and the pride in their voices when she called to tell them she had enlisted. Tomorrow there would be another training session, and the day after that, another one. Sarah closed her eyes and made a silent promise to herself. She would not let fear win. She would not become the cautionary tale that everyone expected her to be. The mockery had begun, but Sarah Martinez was just getting started. The alarm clock's harsh buzz cut through the pre-dawn darkness at 0500 hours. While her bunk mates groaned and rolled over for a few more precious minutes of sleep, Sarah Martinez was already sitting up, wide awake. She had barely slept, her mind replaying yesterday's humiliation at the pool over and over like a broken record. As the other recruits stumbled toward the showers, Sarah quietly slipped out of the barracks. The base was eerily quiet at this hour, with only a few early-rising petty officers moving about their business. Sarah made her way to the pool facility, hoping to find it empty so she could practice without an audience. The pool area was locked, but Sarah discovered that the maintenance crew arrived early to check chemical levels and clean the filters. She waited in the shadows until they finished their work and left a side door propped open for the morning's first training group. The water looked different in the early morning light streaming through the high windows. Less intimidating somehow, though Sarah's heart still raced as she approached the edge. She had borrowed a basic swimming instruction manual from the base library and spent hours studying the proper techniques for treading water and basic strokes. Her first attempt was only marginally better than yesterday's disaster. She managed to stay afloat for about 30 seconds before panic set in, and she had to grab the pool's edge. But those 30 seconds felt like a victory. She rested for a minute, then tried again. By the time the morning training session was scheduled to begin, Sarah had managed to tread water for a full minute without grabbing the edge. Her arms ached and her lungs burned, but she had made progress. Real, measurable progress. When Chief Rodriguez and the other recruits arrived for regular training, Sarah was sitting on a bench, trying to look like she had just arrived herself. Rodriguez's sharp eyes took in her slightly damp hair and the small puddle of water beneath her feet, but he said nothing. "All right, people," Rodriguez called out. "Today we're moving on to basic swimming strokes. But first, everyone in the water for 5 minutes of treading water. Martinez, you're up first." Sarah felt the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach as 40 pairs of eyes focused on her again. Thompson smirked and whispered something to the recruit next to him that made them both laugh. But Sarah walked to the pool's edge with more confidence than she had felt the day before. She entered the water more smoothly this time, remembering to control her breathing and move her arms in the small, efficient motion she had practiced earlier. The first minute passed without panic. Then the second. By the third minute, she could hear surprised murmurs from the other recruits. "Not bad," Rodriguez called out when she reached the 5-minute mark. "Significant improvement." The praise was modest, but coming from the tough chief petty officer, it felt like a major accomplishment. Sarah climbed out of the pool with her head held higher than it had been in days. She caught sight of Thompson's expression and was satisfied to see surprise where she had expected mockery. But the real test came with the swimming strokes. Sarah's technique was still rough and inefficient, but she managed to complete a full length of the pool using a basic freestyle stroke. It was slow and exhausting, but she made it from one end to the other without stopping. "Better," Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "You're still fighting the water instead of working with it, but that's something we can fix." After the official training session ended, Rodriguez approached Sarah as she was toweling off. "Martinez, stick around for a minute." Sarah's stomach dropped. She was certain she was about to receive bad news, perhaps notification that she was being dropped from the program despite her small improvements. Instead, Rodriguez's expression was thoughtful. "I saw the puddle under your feet when we arrived this morning," he said quietly. "And I know the maintenance crew locks up tight when they leave." Sarah's face flushed. She had been caught breaking the rules, accessing the pool facility without permission. "Chief, I can explain." Rodriguez held up a hand to stop her. "I don't want explanations. I want to know how serious you are about overcoming this challenge." "Very serious, Chief. More serious than anything I've ever done in my life." Rodriguez studied her face for a long moment. "There's an advanced training program that runs in the evenings. It's voluntary, and it's tough. Most recruits who sign up for it are already strong swimmers looking to qualify for special programs. But there's no rule that says it's only for the advanced swimmers." Sarah's pulse quickened. "What kind of training?" "Water survival, advanced swimming techniques, and eventually drown-proofing certification. It's taught by Petty Officer Chun, who was a competitive swimmer before she joined the Navy. Fair warning, though, she's tough as nails and doesn't accept excuses." The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Training with the advanced swimmers meant putting herself in a position to be the weakest person in the group all over again. But it also meant access to better instruction and the chance to push herself beyond the basic requirements. "I want to do it," Sarah said without hesitation. "The program starts tomorrow night at 1900 hours. Don't be late, and don't come if you're not prepared to work harder than you've ever worked before." That evening, Sarah called her parents from the base payphone. Her mother answered on the third ring, and Sarah could hear the sounds of her father watching the Spanish-language news in the background. "Mija, how are you?" her mother asked in accented English. "Are you eating enough? Are the other girls treating you well?" Sarah almost told her about the struggles at the pool, about the mockery and the fear. But something stopped her. Instead, she found herself talking about the challenge she was facing and her determination to overcome it. "There's this special training program I qualified for," she said, stretching the truth slightly. "It's for advanced water survival. It means extra training in the evenings, but it could really help my career." "That's wonderful, Mija." Her mother's voice was filled with pride. "Your father and we're so proud of how hard you work. We tell all our friends about our daughter in the Navy." After hanging up, Sarah sat in the barracks common area with the swimming manual open in front of her. She studied diagrams of proper stroke techniques and read about water safety principles. Some of the other recruits glanced at her curiously, but no one bothered to ask what she was reading. Thompson walked by on his way to the vending machines and paused to look over her shoulder. "Studying up for more swimming lessons?" he asked with a grin that wasn't entirely unfriendly. "You did a lot better today." "Thanks," Sarah replied simply, not looking up from her book. "You know," Thompson continued, lowering his voice, "I grew up on a lake in Michigan. Been swimming since I was 5. But I've seen a lot of natural athletes who couldn't handle the water because they never learned to control their fear. The fact that you're improving this fast is actually pretty impressive. Sarah looked up, surprised by the genuine tone in Thompson's voice. Really, really, fear in the water can kill you, but it can also make you stronger if you learn to channel it right. Keep working at it. As Thompson walked away, Sarah felt something shift inside her. The mockery was still there from some quarters, but it was beginning to be mixed with something else. Respect for her determination, perhaps, or at least recognition that she wasn't giving up. The next evening, Sarah stood outside the pool facility at exactly 18:55 hours. Through the windows, she could see a small group of recruits already in the water, moving through warm-up laps with fluid efficiency. These were clearly the advanced swimmers Rodriguez had mentioned. Petty Officer Chun emerged from the facility's office as Sarah approached the entrance. She was a compact woman in her early 30s with the kind of lean muscle that comes from years of serious swimming. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and her eyes assessed Sarah with the intensity of a coach evaluating a potential athlete. "You must be Martinez," Chin said. "Rodriguez told me you'd be joining us. I'll be honest, you're going to be starting at a significant disadvantage compared to the others. Are you prepared for that?" "Yes, Petty Officer." "Good, because in my program, there are no participation trophies. You either improve or you wash out. And I don't accept excuses about backgrounds or fear or anything else. In the water, results are the only thing that matters." Sarah nodded, her throat suddenly dry. "I understand." Chin's expression softened slightly. "But I also don't accept the idea that someone can't learn to be comfortable in the water if they're willing to work for it. Rodriguez says you've shown real determination. Let's see if that's true." As Sarah changed into her swimsuit, she could hear the advanced swimmers in the pool, their movements creating a rhythm of splashes and breathing that sounded like a well-orchestrated performance. In a few minutes, she would be joining them, once again the weakest link in a group of superior athletes. But this time felt different. This time, she was choosing to put herself in that position. This time, she was fighting back. Sarah Martinez walked onto the pool deck with her shoulders straight and her chin up. The mockery had been the beginning of her story, not the end of it 3 weeks into Petty Officer Chin's advanced water survival program. Sarah Martinez was a different person in the water. The panicked flailing had been replaced by controlled movements. She could now swim a full mile without stopping, though it took her nearly twice as long as the other participants. Her treading water had improved from 30 seconds to 20 minutes. But the real test was coming, and everyone knew it. Drown-proofing was the Navy's most challenging water survival exercise. Recruits had their hands tied behind their backs and their feet bound together, then were required to survive in deep water for 20 minutes. They had to demonstrate the ability to float, bob to the surface for air, and even retrieve objects from the bottom of the pool while completely helpless in the water. The exercise was designed to simulate the worst-case scenario: a sailor thrown into the water after a ship explosion or accident, possibly injured, definitely without the use of their arms and legs. It was psychological warfare as much as physical challenge, designed to break recruits who couldn't handle the Navy's demanding water requirements. Sarah had watched videos of the exercise during her evening study sessions. Even experienced swimmers sometimes failed on their first attempt, overwhelmed by the claustrophobic feeling of being completely helpless in deep water. For someone who had started the program afraid to put her head underwater, it seemed like an impossible mountain to climb. Chin's training group had been preparing for weeks. They practiced the breathing techniques, learning to take in maximum air during their brief moments at the surface. They worked on the bobbing motion that would allow them to rise up for air and sink back down while conserving energy. Most importantly, they practiced staying calm when everything in their body screamed panic. "Martinez," Chin called out during one evening session, "you're still fighting the water. Look at Johnson over there." She pointed to a recruit who seemed to move effortlessly even with his limbs bound. "See how he works with the water instead of against it? He's not trying to swim. He's trying to become part of the water itself." Sarah watched Johnson's technique carefully. His movements were minimal and efficient, using the water's natural buoyancy rather than fighting against it. When he needed air, he used a gentle dolphin-like motion to bring his head to the surface, then relax completely to sink back down. "I think I understand," Sarah said, though she wasn't entirely sure she did. "Understanding and doing are different things," Chen replied. "Get back in there and show me." Sarah's attempts that evening were better than before, but still far from the fluid grace she saw in the advanced swimmers. Her bound limbs felt awkward and foreign, and the urge to panic still lurked just beneath the surface of her consciousness, waiting for any sign of weakness. After the session, as Sarah was walking back to the barracks, she encountered Thompson and two other recruits from her original training group. They were coming back from the base recreation center, laughing about something that had happened during their evening off. "Hey, Martinez," Thompson called out. "How's the special training going? Ready for drown-proofing?" "Getting there," Sarah replied cautiously. Over the weeks, Thompson had become less openly hostile, but she still wasn't sure where she stood with him. "You know," said Williams, one of the other recruits, "I heard they're going to do the drown-proofing test next week. All the regular training groups are scheduled for it." Sarah's stomach dropped. She had assumed she would have more time to prepare, more weeks of Chen's intensive training before facing the real test. Next week felt impossibly soon. "Already?" she managed to ask. "Yeah, Chief Rodriguez announced it today during afternoon PT," Thompson said. "Didn't he tell your special group?" The answer was no. Rodriguez had not told him. Sarah realized that she had been so focused on the evening training sessions that she had missed regular announcements about schedule changes. The advanced training group was supplemental to regular requirements, not a replacement for them. That night, Sarah lay awake calculating timelines. She had exactly 6 days before the drown-proofing test. 6 days to master a skill that some recruits with years of swimming experience still struggled with. 6 days to overcome not just the physical challenge, but the psychological terror that had nearly defeated her on the first day. The next morning, she approached Chief Rodriguez after regular training. "Chief, I heard about the drown-proofing test next week. I want to make sure I'm ready." Rodriguez's expression was unreadable. "Martinez, you made impressive progress. But drown-proofing is a different animal entirely. Are you sure you're ready to take on that challenge?" "I won't know unless I try, Chief." "Fair enough. But understand this. If you fail the drown-proofing test, you're out of the program. There are no second chances, no makeup tests. One failure, and you're reassigned to a different service branch or discharged entirely." The weight of those words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Everything she had worked for, all the progress she had made, all the pride her parents felt in their daughter's service, it all came down to 20 minutes in the water with her hands and feet bound. That evening's advanced training session focused entirely on drown-proofing preparation. Chun gathered the group around the pool's edge before they entered the water. "Next week, some of you will face your first drown-proofing test," she announced. "Others will take it later in their training. But everyone needs to understand what this exercise really tests." She paused to make eye contact with each recruit in turn. "It's not about swimming ability. It's about mental toughness. It's about your ability to stay calm when everything seems hopeless. In combat situations, in emergency rescues, in the middle of the ocean when your ship is going down, that's when your real character shows." Sarah felt like Chun was speaking directly to her, though the petty officer's gaze swept across the entire group. The water doesn't care about your background or your fears or your limitations. It only responds to your actions and your mental state. If you panic, you sink. If you stay calm and work with the water instead of against it, you survive. During that night's practice session, something clicked for Sarah. As she bobbed in the deep end of the pool with her limbs bound, instead of fighting for the surface, she began to trust the water to support her. Instead of thrashing frantically for air, she used controlled, efficient movements to rise and fall. For the first time, she completed a full 20-minute drown-proofing simulation. The other recruits in the advanced group clapped as she touched the pool's edge at the end of her session. Even Shin allowed herself a small smile of approval. "Not bad, Martinez. You're starting to think like a swimmer instead of victim." But Sarah knew that practice sessions and real tests were different things entirely. The pressure of knowing that failure meant the end of her Navy career would add a psychological weight that no amount of practice could fully simulate. Over the next few days, word of the upcoming drown-proofing test spread throughout the entire recruit training center. Sarah noticed other recruits looking at her differently now, some with curiosity about whether the girl who had nearly drowned on her first day could actually pass the Navy's toughest water survival test. Others with a kind of nervous energy that suggested they were worried about their own upcoming challenges. 3 days before the test, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Petty Officer Chun appeared at the barracks during evening study time and asked to speak with her privately. "Walk with me," Chun said simply. They strolled across the base in comfortable silence, past the parade grounds where recruits were practicing marching drills under floodlights. Finally, Chun spoke. "Rodriguez told me about your background. Growing up in the desert, never having access to swimming instruction, enlisting despite your fear of water." Sarah nodded, not sure where this conversation was heading. "You remind me of myself at your age," Chun continued. "I grew up poor in San Francisco's Chinatown. My parents worked in restaurants and laundries, saving every penny for my education. I was afraid of the water, too, until I was 12 and nearly drowned at a public pool." This revelation surprised Sarah. She had assumed that Chun was a natural athlete who had been swimming since childhood. "After that near drowning, I became obsessed with conquering my fear. I spent every free hour at the community center pool, learning everything I could about water survival. By the time I graduated high school, I was competing at the state level." They had reached the edge of the base, where a tall fence separated the Naval Training Center from the civilian world beyond. Chun stopped walking and turned to face Sarah directly. "The point is, fear can be your greatest enemy or your most powerful motivator. It depends entirely on how you choose to use it." Sarah considered this wisdom as they walked back toward the barracks. "Petty Officer Chun," she said finally, "what if I'm not ready? What if all this training isn't enough?" Chen's answer was immediate and firm. "Then you'll find out what you're really made of when it matters most. And that's when the best sailors are born, in the moments when they discover they're stronger than they ever thought possible." 2 days before the test, Sarah called her parents again. This time, she told them about the challenge she was facing, though she kept the details general enough to avoid worrying them unnecessarily. "Mija," her mother said softly, "your father and I came to this country with nothing but hope and determination. We faced challenges that seemed impossible, but we never gave up because we knew our children deserved better. That same strength is in you. Trust it." As Sarah hung up the phone, she realized that this test had become about more than just her own Navy career. It represented the dreams of parents who had sacrificed everything for their children's opportunities. It represented the possibility that someone could overcome any limitation with enough determination and hard work. The night before the drown-proofing test, Sarah Martinez lay in her bunk and listened to the sounds of 40 other young women preparing for sleep. Some of them would face their own test tomorrow. All of them were fighting their own battles to prove they belonged in the Navy. But for Sarah, tomorrow would determine whether months of struggle and growth had been enough to overcome a lifetime of fear. Tomorrow would reveal whether the girl who had nearly drowned in 3 feet of water could survive 20 minutes in the deep end with her hands and feet bound. Tomorrow would be the breaking point that would either destroy her dreams or forge them into something unbreakable that the morning of the drown-proofing test dawned gray and cold at Great Lakes Naval Training Center. Sarah Martinez woke before her alarm, her stomach churning with a mixture of anticipation and terror that had kept her awake most of the night. Around her, other recruits were beginning to stir, and she could sense the same nervous energy that she felt radiating throughout the barracks. Today wasn't just about her test. 43 recruits from 3 different training divisions will be taking their drown-proofing examinations. For some, it would be a routine confirmation of skills they had possessed for years. For others, it would be the make-or-break moment that determined whether they continued in the Navy or found themselves on a bus home. Sarah had barely touched her breakfast, despite knowing she would need energy for the grueling test ahead. The dining hall buzzed with quiet conversations as recruits discussed their strategies and tried to calm their nerves. She noticed that even the strongest swimmers looked tense, understanding that drown-proofing was as much a mental challenge as a physical one. Chief Rodriguez addressed all the test candidates in the pool facility's briefing room at 0800 hours. His usual stern expression seemed slightly softer as he looked out over the group of nervous young sailors. Today, you'll be taking the most challenging water survival test the Navy requires, he began. Some of you will pass on your first attempt. Others may not. Remember that this test exists for a reason, to ensure that every sailor can survive in the worst possible circumstances. He paused to let his words sink in. You'll be tested individually, in groups of 5. Each candidate will have exactly 20 minutes to demonstrate water survival skills with hands and feet bound. You must show that you can float, bob for air, and retrieve an object from the pool floor. Failure to complete any component results in immediate disqualification from Navy water training programs. Sarah's mouth went dry as Rodriguez continued with the technical details. The rope bindings would be tight enough to prevent any use of arms or legs, but not so tight as to cut off circulation. Each candidate would be monitored by 2 qualified lifeguards and a Navy swim instructor. Any sign of genuine distress would result in immediate rescue, but also automatic failure. Martinez, Rodriguez called out as the briefing ended. A word. Sarah's heart hammered as she approached the chief petty officer. Around her, other recruits were filing out to begin their preparation routines, leaving her alone with Rodriguez in the briefing room. I want you to know, Rodriguez said quietly, that regardless of what happens today, you've already accomplished something remarkable. When you first walked into my pool facility 2 months ago, I honestly didn't think you'd last a week. Sarah wasn't sure how to respond to this unexpected admission, but you've proven that determination can overcome almost any obstacle. Don't let fear undo all the progress you've made. Trust your training and trust yourself. The first group of test candidates included Thompson and 4 other strong swimmers from Sarah's original training division. Sarah watched from the observation deck as they entered the water with confident movements, their hands and feet bound with regulation rope. Thompson, despite his earlier mockery of Sarah's abilities, struggled more than expected. The psychological pressure of being helpless in deep water affected him differently than the practice sessions had. He completed the test successfully, but with visible strain and much less margin for error than his swimming ability had suggested. Sarah realized that drown-proofing truly was the great equalizer that Sean had described. Natural swimming talent helped, but the mental challenge could defeat anyone who wasn't prepared for it psychologically. Groups 2 and 3 completed their tests with mixed results. 2 recruits failed, both experienced swimmers who had apparently underestimated the psychological demands of the exercise. Their failures served as sobering reminders that confidence alone wasn't enough. Sarah was assigned to the 4th group, along with Williams from her original division and 3 recruits she didn't know well. As they prepared to enter the pool area, Williams leaned over and whispered, "Good luck, Martinez. I know how hard you've worked for this." The simple words of encouragement meant more to Sarah than Williams probably realized. Not long ago, she had been the target of mockery and doubt. Now, fellow recruits were genuinely rooting for her success. The pool looked exactly the same as it had during countless practice sessions, but the atmosphere was completely different. Official observers sat in elevated chairs around the pool deck. A Navy photographer documented the proceedings. This wasn't practice anymore. This was the real test that would determine Sarah's future. Petty Officer Chun appeared beside the testing group as they prepared to enter the water. She wasn't officially part of the testing staff, but she had received permission to observe her advanced training students. "Remember everything we practiced," she said simply, making eye contact with Sarah. "The water is your friend, not your enemy. Work with it." Sarah nodded, trying to project more confidence than she felt. Her hands were shaking slightly as the rope bindings were applied, but she forced herself to breathe steadily and focus on the techniques she had rehearsed hundreds of times. The rope around her hands was tighter than she was used to in practice, and the binding around her ankles felt restrictive in a way that made her briefly panic before she regained control. She watched the instructor test the knots, ensuring they were secure enough to prevent cheating, but not dangerous. "Candidates, enter the water," called out Lieutenant Commander Hayes, the senior testing official. Sarah slipped into the deep end of the pool, along with the 4 other recruits in her group. The water temperature was exactly what she had grown accustomed to, but her heart was racing fast enough that she could hear her pulse in her ears. 20-minute survival test begins now, Hayes announced. For the first few minutes, Sarah focused entirely on establishing her rhythm. Bob to the surface for air, relax, and sink back down. Use minimal energy to maintain position. The techniques that had become second nature during practice sessions felt foreign and difficult under the pressure of official examination. Around her, she was aware of the other candidates following similar patterns. Williams seemed to be struggling more than she had expected, his movements less controlled than they had been during practice sessions. 2 of the other recruits appeared comfortable, while the 5th was showing signs of early distress. 5 minutes into the test, Sarah found her groove. Her breathing became more controlled, her movements more efficient. She began to trust the water to support her weight, just as Chun had taught her to do. For the first time since entering the pool, she allowed herself to believe that she might actually complete the test successfully. The real challenge came at the 10-minute mark, when the testing officials introduced the object retrieval component. A weighted ring was dropped to the pool floor, and each candidate had to demonstrate the ability to dive down and bring it back to the surface using only their teeth. Sarah watched Williams attempt the dive first. He managed to reach the ring, but couldn't grip it properly with his teeth and had to surface without completing the task. On his second attempt, he succeeded, but the effort had clearly cost him significant energy. When Sarah's turn came, she forced herself to take an extra-large breath before diving. The descent felt controlled and smooth, exactly as she had practiced. The ring was exactly where she expected it to be, and she managed to grasp it firmly with her teeth on the first attempt. The ascent back to the surface felt like it took forever, but when she finally broke through and took her next breath, she still had the ring securely in her mouth. She had completed the most technically challenging component of the test. 15 minutes into the examination, one of the other candidates in Sarah's group began showing signs of serious distress. His movements became erratic and panicked, and within seconds, 2 lifeguards were pulling him from the water. His test was over, and his Navy water training program along with it. Watching a fellow recruit fail so close to the finish line provided Sarah with a stark reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. She forced herself to stay calm and maintain her rhythm, even as part of her mind sympathized with the recruit who had just seen his Navy career end. At the 18-minute mark, Sarah realized that she was going to complete the test successfully. Her energy levels were still manageable, her breathing remained controlled, and her movements continued to be efficient. More importantly, the psychological fear that had nearly overwhelmed her during her first pool experience was completely absent. Instead of fear, Sarah felt a growing sense of triumph. Not just because she was passing the test, but because she had fundamentally changed who she was as a person. The girl who had panicked in 3 feet of water no longer existed. In her place was a young sailor who could survive 20 minutes in deep water with her limbs bound. Time. Lieutenant Commander Hayes called out exactly 20 minutes after the test had begun. Sarah touched the pool's edge and looked up to see Chun smiling down at her from the observation deck. Around the pool, the testing officials were marking their scorecards. Williams had also completed the test successfully, though he looked thoroughly exhausted by the experience. Candidates Martinez, Williams, Jackson, and Liu, congratulations. You have successfully completed Navy drown-proofing certification, Hayes announced. The words hit Sarah like a physical force. She had done it. After months of struggle, fear, and determination, she had passed the most challenging test the Navy could throw at her. She was officially certified as a Navy swimmer, qualified for any assignment that required water survival skills. As she climbed out of the pool, Sarah caught sight of Chief Rodriguez watching from the doorway. He gave her a small nod of approval that somehow meant more than any elaborate praise could have. Thompson appeared beside the pool as Sarah was toweling off. "Martinez," he said with genuine respect. "That was impressive. I mean, really impressive." "Thanks," Sarah replied, still processing the magnitude of what had just happened. "I owe you an apology," Thompson continued. "When you first showed up and couldn't handle basic treading water, I thought you didn't belong here. I was wrong. You've got more determination than most people I've ever met." Later that evening, Sarah called her parents from the base payphone. When her mother answered, Sarah could barely contain her excitement. "Mama, I passed. I passed the big water test I told you about." "Oh, Mija." Her mother's voice was filled with pride and joy. "We are so proud of you. Your father is here. Tell him the good news." As Sarah shared the details of her success with her parents, she realized that this moment represented more than just personal achievement. It represented the power of refusing to accept limitations, the value of hard work and determination, and the possibility of becoming someone completely different from who you started as. But what Sarah didn't know was that her real test was just beginning. In 3 days, an unexpected visitor would arrive at Great Lakes Naval Training Center, and Sarah's demonstration of water survival skills would take on a significance she never could have imagined. The drown-proofing test had been passed, but her story was far from over. 3 days after passing her drown-proofing test, Sarah Martinez was going through her regular morning routine when an unusual announcement crackled over the barracks loudspeakers at 0600 hours. All personnel. Prepare for distinguished visitor inspection. Admiral Patricia Morrison will be conducting facility tours and recruit observations beginning at 0900 hours. Dress blues required for all personnel in contact areas. Sarah paused in folding her bunk linens. Admiral Morrison was a legend in the Navy, the first woman to command a carrier battle group, and currently serving as Deputy Chief of Naval Operations. Her visit to Great Lakes Naval Training Center was unprecedented and unexpected. Word spread quickly through the barracks that the Admiral's visit was part of a comprehensive review of Navy training programs. Recent congressional hearings had questioned whether the Navy's training standards adequately prepared sailors for modern combat situations. Admiral Morrison was personally evaluating multiple facilities to provide recommendations to the Chief of Naval Operations. As Sarah and her fellow recruits prepared for inspection, none of them could have predicted that the Admiral's visit would intersect with their water training program. The schedule called for Admiral Morrison to observe various training activities, including academic instruction, physical fitness programs, and technical skills development. At 1030 hours, Admiral Morrison arrived at the pool facility with an entourage that included 2 other flag officers, several staff members, and the base commanding officer. Sarah's training division happened to be scheduled for water survival practice during the Admiral's visit. Chief Rodriguez had prepared his most impressive demonstration for the distinguished visitors. The advanced training group, including Sarah, would showcase various water survival techniques, culminating in a drown-proofing demonstration by volunteers. Admiral Morrison was an imposing figure even at 53 years old. Her silver hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her uniform displayed ribbons representing 3 decades of distinguished service. But it was her eyes that caught everyone's attention, sharp, intelligent, and constantly evaluating everything around her. "Chief Rodriguez," Admiral Morrison said as she surveyed the pool facility, "I understand this is where you conduct the Navy's most challenging water survival training." "Yes, ma'am. We believe that every sailor must be prepared to survive in the worst possible water conditions. Our drown-proofing program has maintained a 93% first-attempt success rate. Impressive statistics. But What about the 7% who don't pass on their first attempt? Rodriguez hesitated slightly. Some recruits require additional training before they're ready for the challenge, Admiral. Others are reassigned to programs that don't require advanced water survival certification. I see. And what determines which recruits get the additional training versus reassignment? Sarah noticed that this question seemed to make Rodriguez uncomfortable. The truth was that most recruits who failed drown-proofing were simply moved to different programs rather than given intensive remedial training. The additional training that had saved Sarah's Navy career was an exception, not the standard practice. Well, Admiral, that depends on various factors, including the recruit's potential for improvement and available training resources. Admiral Morrison's sharp gaze suggested she understood the diplomatic nature of Rodriguez's answer. She was clearly someone who preferred direct truth to bureaucratic evasion. Chief, I'd like to see a demonstration of your drown-proofing training. Can you arrange for some of your most proficient recruits to show us the techniques? Absolutely, Admiral. I have several volunteers from our advanced training group who would be honored to demonstrate. Rodriguez looked toward the advanced training group, and his eyes settled on the recruits he considered his most reliable performers. But before he could select volunteers, Admiral Morrison stepped forward with her own request. Actually, Chief, I'm more interested in seeing the techniques demonstrated by recruits who have overcome significant challenges to master these skills. In combat situations, our sailors often have to perform beyond their natural comfort zones. I want to see evidence that your training develops that kind of resilience. Sarah felt her heart begin to race. Admiral Morrison's request seemed to be pointing directly toward her situation, though it was impossible to know if that was intentional. Rodriguez's expression showed his dilemma. His safest choice would be to select naturally gifted swimmers who could perform flawlessly under pressure. But the Admiral had specifically asked for recruits who had overcome challenges, and Sarah's story was well known throughout the facility. Admiral, Petty Officer Chen stepped forward unexpectedly. If I may make a suggestion? Admiral Morrison turned her attention to Chun with obvious interest. As a competitive swimmer turned Navy trainer, Chun commanded respect even among senior officers. I have a recruit who might exemplify exactly what you're looking for. Recruit Martinez started this program with significant water phobia, but has demonstrated extraordinary determination in overcoming her limitations. She passed her drown-proofing certification just 3 days ago. Sarah's face flushed as she realized she was being discussed by an admiral of the United States Navy. Around her, fellow recruits were looking at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. Interesting, Admiral Morrison said, studying Sarah with those sharp eyes. Recruit Martinez stepped forward. Sarah's legs felt weak as she approached the Admiral. Everything about this situation was surreal, being personally addressed by one of the highest-ranking officers in the Navy while standing in a pool facility wearing training gear. Ma'am, Recruit Martinez reporting as requested. At ease, Recruit. I understand you've had an unusual journey to drown-proofing certification. Tell me about it. The question was so direct and unexpected that Sarah struggled to find an appropriate response. How do you summarize months of struggle, fear, and determination in a brief reply to an admiral? Ma'am, I enlisted in the Navy despite having limited swimming experience. The water training program was initially very challenging for me, but I was fortunate to receive additional instruction that helped me develop the necessary skills. Admiral Morrison's expression suggested she was hearing the diplomatic version of a much more complex story. Recruit Martinez, in my experience, the most interesting stories come from people who have overcome significant obstacles. I'm not looking for a sanitized summary. I want to understand what you actually went through. Something in the Admiral's tone encouraged honesty over protocol. Sarah took a deep breath and decided to tell the truth. Ma'am, on my first day of water training, I panicked in 3 feet of water and had to be rescued by the lifeguard. Many people suggested I should consider a different service branch. But I didn't want to give up, so I started practicing on my own time, and eventually qualified for Petty Officer Chin's advanced training program. How long did it take you to progress from needing rescue in 3 feet of water to passing drown-proofing certification? Approximately 2 months, ma'am. Admiral Morrison exchanged glances with the other flag officers in her group. Sarah caught a subtle nod between them that suggested this information was somehow significant. Recruit Martinez, would you be willing to demonstrate your drown-proofing skills for our group? The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. Performing water survival techniques in front of an admiral and her staff was pressure beyond anything she had experienced, even during the official test. Yes, ma'am, I will be honored. As Sarah prepared for the demonstration, Admiral Morrison addressed the assembled group of observers. Ladies and gentlemen, what we're about to see represents the kind of transformation that excellent training programs should produce. The ability to take someone with significant limitations and develop them into a capable performer is the hallmark of superior instruction. Sarah entered the water with her hands and feet being bound by Chief Rodriguez himself. The familiar feeling of rope around her limbs no longer induced panic, but performing in front of such distinguished observers added a psychological pressure she had never experienced. Begin demonstration, Admiral Morrison called out. Sarah settled into her rhythm immediately. Bob to the surface for air, sink back down, conserve energy, maintain control. The techniques that had once seemed impossible now felt natural and automatic. She could hear quiet conversations among the observers, but she forced herself to focus entirely on her performance. At the 10-minute mark, Rodriguez dropped the weighted ring for the object retrieval demonstration. Sarah's dive to the pool floor was smooth and controlled, and she grasped the ring with her teeth on the first attempt. When she surfaced with the ring, she could see approval in Admiral Morrison's expression. 15 minutes into the demonstration, Sarah realized she was actually enjoying the performance. Instead of struggling to survive, she was showcasing skills she was genuinely proud of possessing. The transformation from her first day in the water felt complete. When the 20-minute demonstration ended, Sarah climbed out of the pool to find Admiral Morrison waiting with what appeared to be genuine admiration in her expression. Outstanding, Recruit Martinez. That was a textbook demonstration of water survival skills. Thank you, ma'am. But Admiral Morrison wasn't finished. She turned to address the entire group assembled around the pool. What we've just witnessed illustrates an important principle about military training and human potential. 2 months ago, this recruit was considered unsuitable for Navy water programs. Today, she has demonstrated skills that would be creditable for any sailor in the fleet. Sarah felt her cheeks burning as the Admiral continued. The difference wasn't natural ability or prior experience. The difference was quality instruction, personal determination, and an institution that was willing to invest in developing potential rather than simply screening for existing talent. Admiral Morrison paused to look directly at Sarah. Recruit Martinez, your story represents the best traditions of Navy training. You've demonstrated that with proper instruction and personal commitment, anyone can master the skills necessary to serve their country effectively. What happened next was so unexpected that Sarah later wondered if she had imagined it. Admiral Morrison reached into her uniform jacket and withdrew a small presentation case. Inside was a coin bearing the Admiral's personal seal, a rare honor given to service members who had made exceptional impressions on flag officers. Recruit Martinez, I'm presenting you with my personal coin in recognition of your outstanding demonstration of the warrior spirit that makes our Navy strong. The pool facility fell completely silent as Admiral Morrison placed the coin in Sarah's hand. Personal coins from flag officers were among the most treasured recognitions in military service, typically given to seasoned sailors who had performed exceptionally in combat or critical situations. Ma'am, Sarah managed to say, I don't know what to say. Say that you'll remember this moment when you face future challenges in your Navy career. And remember that the determination you've shown here will serve you well in whatever assignment you receive. As the Admiral and her entourage prepared to leave the facility, she turned back for one final comment. Chief Rodriguez, Petty Officer Chun, whatever you're doing in this program, keep doing it. The training methods that produced this transformation should be studied and replicated throughout our system. Later that evening, word of Admiral Morrison's visit and Sarah's recognition had spread throughout the entire training center. Recruits who barely knew Sarah were congratulating her in the dining hall. Instructors who had never spoken to her were nodding respectfully as she passed. But the most meaningful moment came when Sarah called her parents that night. "Mija," her mother said through tears of joy, "an Admiral gave you a special honor?" "Yes, Mama." She said, "I represented the best traditions of Navy training. Your father and I, we are so proud. We came to this country with nothing, and now our daughter is being honored by admirals. This is the American dream, Mija." As Sarah sat in the barracks common area that night, turning the Admiral's coin over in her hands, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 2 months ago, she had been the recruit everyone expected to fail. Tonight, she was holding a personal recognition from one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States Navy. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. It had required confronting her deepest fears, pushing through countless moments of doubt, and refusing to accept the limitations that others had tried to impose on her. But it had also demonstrated something profound about human potential and the power of determination. Sarah Martinez had started as someone who was laughed at for her inability to handle basic water training. She was ending as someone whose story would be told throughout the Navy as an example of what was possible when talent met opportunity and determination. The girl from the Arizona desert who had been afraid of water had become a sailor whose water survival skills impressed admirals. It was a transformation that would define not just her Navy career, but her entire understanding of what she was capable of achieving. As she prepared for sleep that night, Sarah smiled as she remembered Admiral Morrison's final words to her. "Remember that the determination you've shown here will serve you well in whatever assignment you receive." Sarah had a feeling that this was just the beginning of her story, not the end of it. The Admiral's coin would serve as a reminder that extraordinary things were possible when someone refused to accept the word impossible. The mockery had ended. The recognition had begun. And somewhere in the vast expanse of the world's oceans, future challenges were waiting for a sailor who had learned that fear could be transformed into strength, and limitations could become launching pads for great. And Sarah Martinez had always been afraid of water. Growing up in the desert town of Phoenix, Arizona, swimming pools were luxury items that her family couldn't afford. The closest she came to deep water was the occasional splash in the community center's shallow kiddie pool during summer heat waves. So when she enlisted in the Navy at 19, the thought of mandatory swim training filled her with dread that kept her awake for nights. The recruitment officer had glossed over the water training requirements, focusing instead on the technical opportunities and educational benefits. Sarah was drawn to the Navy's promise of electronics training and the chance to serve her country while building a better future. Her parents, both hardworking immigrants who cleaned office buildings at night, were proud but worried about their daughter's decision to join military. Boot camp at Great Lakes Naval Training Center arrived faster than Sarah had anticipated. The first few weeks focused on marching, physical fitness, and classroom instruction. Sarah excelled in academics and showed determination in physical training, earning respect from her drill instructors. Her bunk mates knew her as quiet but reliable, someone who would help others with their studies late into the night. But everyone knew that water training was coming. The rumors spread through the barracks like wildfire. Stories of recruits who had washed out because they couldn't handle the swimming requirements. Tales of the infamous drown-proofing exercise that separated the strong from the weak. Sarah listened to these stories with growing anxiety, her stomach churning every time someone mentioned the pool. When the day finally arrived, Sarah stood at the edge of the Olympic-sized training pool with 40 other nervous recruits. The water looked impossibly deep and dark. The The smell of chlorine burned her nostrils as she watched other groups of trainees already in the water, some struggling, others moving with confidence that she envied. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, a weathered man with 20 years of Navy experience, stood before the group with his arms crossed. His voice carried across the pool deck as he explained the basics of Navy water survival. Every sailor, he declared, must be comfortable in the water because the ocean doesn't care about your background or fears. The first exercise was basic treading water. Sarah watched as her fellow recruits jumped in one by one. Some moved through the water like they were born in it. Others struggled, but managed to keep their heads above the surface. When her turn came, Sarah's hands were shaking as she approached the pool's edge. The water was colder than she expected. As soon as she hit the surface, panic set in. Her arms flailed wildly as she tried to remember the techniques they had just learned. Water rushed in her mouth and nose as she fought to stay afloat. The lifeguard was beside her within seconds, pulling her to the side of the pool as she coughed and sputtered. "Martinez!" Chief Rodriguez's voice boomed across the pool. What was that supposed to be? Sarah's face burned with embarrassment as she clung to the pool's edge, still catching her breath. Around her, she could hear snickers from some of the other recruits. Someone whispered loud enough for her to hear, "How did she even make it through the physical fitness test?" "I'm sorry, Chief," Sarah managed to say between coughs. "I'll do better." "You'll do better?" Rodriguez walked over to where Sarah was hanging onto the pool's edge. "Martinez, you just went into panic mode the second you hit the water. This isn't a game. In the Navy, your life might depend on your ability to survive in water." The other recruits had stopped their own exercises to watch the spectacle. Sarah felt 40 pairs of eyes on her as she struggled to compose herself. The chlorinated water still burned her throat, and her soaked uniform clung uncomfortably to her skin. "Chief, maybe she should consider a different branch," called out Recruit Thompson, one of the stronger swimmers who had been showing off his butterfly stroke earlier. "The Army doesn't require swimming, right?" Laughter rippled through the group. Even some of the recruits who had struggled with their own swimming seemed relieved to have someone performing worse than them. Sarah's cheeks burned hotter than the Arizona sun she had left behind. Rodriguez silenced the group with a sharp look, but Sarah caught the expression on his face. It was a mixture of concern and disappointment that cut deeper than any harsh words could have. She realized that her drill instructor was already writing her off, already assuming she wouldn't make it through the program. "Everyone back to your exercises," Rodriguez commanded. "Martinez, you're going to sit this one out and watch. Pay attention to how the others move in the water." Sitting on the pool deck in her dripping uniform, Sarah watched her fellow recruits continue their training. The easy confidence of the experienced swimmers made her feel even more inadequate. They moved through the water like it was their natural element, while she felt like she was drowning in her own fear. The worst part wasn't the physical discomfort or even the embarrassment. It was the look of pity she saw in some eyes and the barely concealed relief in others. She was becoming the cautionary tale, the example of what happens when you're not prepared for Navy life. As the training session continued, Sarah overheard conversations that weren't meant for her ears. Recruits speculating about whether she would be dropped from the program, bets being placed on how long she would last. The assumption that someone who couldn't handle basic treading water had no business being in the Navy. When the session finally ended, Sarah walked back to the barracks alone. Her wet uniform squeaked with each step, a constant reminder of her failure. She passed groups of recruits discussing the day's training, but conversations stopped when they saw her approaching. The isolation was almost as painful as the fear itself. That night, as she lay in her narrow bunk listening to the sounds of 40 women settling in for sleep, Sarah stared at the ceiling and wondered if everyone was right. Maybe she had made a terrible mistake. Maybe someone who grew up afraid of water had no business trying to serve in the Navy. But somewhere in the darkness, beneath the embarrassment and fear, a small flame of determination flickered. Sarah had not come this far to give up after one bad day. She thought about her parents, working their night shifts to support the family, and the pride in their voices when she called to tell them she had enlisted. Tomorrow there would be another training session, and the day after that, another one. Sarah closed her eyes and made a silent promise to herself. She would not let fear win. She would not become the cautionary tale that everyone expected her to be. The mockery had begun, but Sarah Martinez was just getting started.